Good evening and welcome. Welcome to New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, a congregation of 400 members in the heart of the nation's capital, just 2 blocks from the White House. It is known that the 16th president of that White House worshiped with us, Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, we have much engaging history here. I welcome you on behalf of the session and our pastors, the Reverend Dr. Sarah Johnson and the Reverend Rachel Pacheco. I am the Reverend Beth Braxton, one of the parish associates here at the church. To know us is to know that every Sunday morning we feed a hot breakfast to over 100 persons experience homelessness. And that every Thursday evening we tutor one-on-one 80 DC high school students. To know us is that for 40 years we've had a 5-day-a-week quality mental health care program. And we have partnered for 25 years with the First Presbyterian Church of Havana, Cuba. And we have a partnership in Njoro, Kenya, where we care and support 35 orphan children. To know us is to know that the entire lower level of our building is in use by Washington, D.C. It's a place where people 6 days a week can get a shower, wash their clothes, use computers and the internet, get counseling for identification papers, get haircuts, and a nice lunch. And of course, one of the central program ministries of this church is why you're here tonight, the Scholar in Residence, where investments from the estate of the Reverend Jack McClendon, the associate pastor here for over 30 years, is being used to bring refreshing voices, theological voices like Brian McLaren, for all of us to be able to hear and to learn and to grow spiritually. We're glad you're here tonight. Welcome. And let us join our hearts and minds to begin with a word of prayer. Let us pray. O God of the resurrection life, we come together in the freshness of this Eastertide season, grateful to be alive, grateful for time and new beginnings, grateful for the challenges of this day and time, the power struggles, the hateful rhetoric, the political divisions, the fears, the standards for truth, the challenges to our Christian faith. Yes, we're grateful. Grateful for the community to know that we are not alone, that you and the body of Christ are always with us for presence, dialogue, love, and hope. And especially tonight, we are grateful for Brian McLaren, that you have uniquely called him with insights, wisdom, and words, and a heart to share this good news with us. Hear all our needs and meditations of our hearts, we pray. We pray in the name of the one who is our bread and our light for the way, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Beth, for that welcome and for saying a bit about New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. I want to join Beth in welcoming you to this webinar. We're pleased to have you with us, whether you've been to many of our previous programs or perhaps joining us for the first time. As Beth mentioned, the McClendon Scholar Program has been around since 2008, hosting a wide variety of prominent Christian thinkers and authors and activists. And we've now grown to where we have 10 programs approximately every year. We will keep you informed about all our scheduled activities and hope to see you with us frequently in the future. As always, we're interested to see where our webinar participants are from. And I want to invite you to, if you will, want to use the chat function and type in a bit about who you are and where you're from. We know that most of our participants, many of them come from the DC area, but we also have people from all over the country who tune in, and we have almost 1,000 people registered tonight. So we know we have people from all over the country who are with us. So I see some of you starting to type in. I see people from Delaware and Charlotte, North Carolina, and Fort Worth. I think you can see the list also there. Many places around the country, as well as in the DC area, Rockville, so many. And it's just great to see such a wide variety of people from all over the country joining us this evening. Continue to type that in. We look at this afterwards and see who's with us and get a sense of how our reach is extending. And it's good to know of the different individuals and organizations and congregations represented. As you, of course, know, tonight our program features Brian McLaren, and I will introduce him to you in just a few minutes. I'm pleased to say that this is the first of 3 programs we'll be having with Brian this year. And I hope you'll mark your calendars, if you haven't already, for the next webinar, which will be on May 8th. And then also note on the weekend of October 5 and 6, Brian will be with us in person for some programs at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in downtown Washington, D.C. Those presentations at the church will also be available via webinar for those of you who are outside of the D.C. area. Tonight's program is billed as a conversation with Brian McLaren, and that is exactly what it will be. Brian will make a presentation at the May 8th webinar and this fall when he's with us in person, but not tonight. Tonight, we're going to have a discussion with him to learn more about him as a person and the work he's been doing now for more than 20 years. In particular, we're going to have him talk about insights from some of his better well-known and also recent books, especially A New Kind of Christianity, Faith After Doubt, and Do I Stay Christian? I'll be starting off this conversation with Brian by asking him a number of questions that I have, and also some questions that have been suggested by others. Several members of our church, as well as other people who registered for the program, have sent in questions they'd like me to ask, and I'm going to incorporate as many of them as I can into our discussion. After Brian and I have talked for a while, we'll expand the conversation and select some questions that you send in while we are talking. If a question occurs to you while Brian and I are talking together in the early part of the program, please enter it into the Q&A function, which on most computers should be near the bottom of your screen. And we're also going to keep the chat function open, where you can share comments and resources if you want to at different times throughout the evening. But don't put your questions in chat. We'll be monitoring Q&A. Use the chat only for comments or other things you want to share with either the panelists or with others who are here. Now, if you submit a question, try to keep it brief and to the point. Also, if you aren't exactly sure how to word a question, maybe you know something you'd like to ask Brian about, but you don't know how to ask it, you can just say something like, would you please say a little bit more about this or about that we've discussed earlier in the evening. And that is another way to just probe a little and get him to talk a little bit more about a topic of interest to you. Meg House, those of you in New York Avenue know well, is an active member of our church, and she was also formerly on our McClendon Scholar Council. Now, Meg will be monitoring the questions as they come in and selecting some for use. So after Brian and I talk for a while, I'll call on Meg, and she'll share some of the questions that you have submitted. After our time for questions is over, I'll share just a bit of information about the next webinar with Brian in May, and some other upcoming McClendon Scholar programs. After that, I will call on Brian again to make some closing remarks about whatever he wants to say to highlight about the evening as we end our time together. And we will close no later than 8:30 p.m. I also want to let you know this program is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be sent to everyone who has registered for this program sometime in the next few days. It is now my pleasure to introduce Brian McLaren to you. Brian McLaren is an author, speaker, activist, and I think could rightly also be described as a public theologian. He's a former college English teacher and pastor who's known primarily as a writer and thinker, who's a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity. We'll be talking about that tonight along with other topics. Brian is the author of more than 20 books, many of which have been translated into other languages, including Korean, Chinese, French, Swedish, German, and Spanish. He has written for or contributed interviews to many periodicals, is a frequent guest on television, radio, and news programs. His work has been covered widely by such well-known publications as Time Magazine, the New York Times, Christianity Today, Christian Century, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, and many other print and online media. Brian is from the Washington, D.C. area. He's a graduate of the University of Maryland, both bachelor's and master's degrees in English. From 1978 to 1986, he taught college English in the D.C. area, and in 1982, helped to form the Cedar Ridge Community Church, an innovative non-denominational church in Spencerville, Maryland. He left higher education in 1986 to serve as the church's founding pastor, and he served in that capacity until 2006. Brian is currently a core member of the faculty and dean of the faculty for the Center for Action and Contemplation, and he hosts a regular podcast called Learning How to See. He has taught or lectured at many seminaries and denominational interfaith gatherings, and of course, he also continues to write. His next book, Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World That is Falling Apart, is now available for pre-order and will be released publicly next month. Brian and his wife, Grace, have 4 adult children and 5 grandchildren, and his personal interests include wildlife and ecology, fly fishing and kayaking, music and songwriting, and literature. Brian McLaren is one of the most important voices in American Christianity today and has been celebrated as an heroic gatecrasher, a paradigm shifter, and a wise voice who is a breath of fresh air. Of course, since he critiques the religious establishment, he's also been called a controversial religious leader, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a heretic, and much worse things that I won't mention at this time. We're delighted to have Brian with us, and I want to welcome him now to join us for conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, Theo. I just want to say how grateful I am to you for this conversation. I feel like we've gotten to know each other and become friends over recent weeks. And also what an honor it is to be part of this McClendon lecture series. What a great thing that Jack McClendon did to get this going. And what a gift to this congregation and to all of us really who are part of this through many, many years. So happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Well, we're glad to have you. I was heartened and encouraged to see you write in one of your books about some of the people who have inspired you. And at least 4 of them have been McClendon scholars that you mentioned. Yeah. So we've been inspired by many of the same people who you've learned from through the years. Yes. So we're glad to have you in a webinar. We look forward to having you with us in person in the fall. As we begin, I'd like you to tell us briefly about your personal spiritual journey. From what you describe as being a zealous fundamentalist teenager to the Brian McLaren of today, who's written so many books urging people to think about Christianity in new ways. Those who've read your books are familiar with much about your personal story, but others may not be as aware of it. And I think it'd be helpful for you to summarize that for us as we begin our time together.
Sure, Theo. Well, let me say I was brought up by wonderful Christian parents who kept a little bit of fun in fundamentalism. I grew up in a little sect that many folks have probably never heard of. It was called the Plymouth Brethren, a really interesting group with interesting history. If any of you have ever heard of the Rapture, that was invented and promulgated by the Plymouth Brethren that I came from in the early 1930s. I think one of the less helpful ideas ever to enter Christian thought, very popular still today, far more well known than the Plymouth Brethren themselves. Folks might be familiar with the fact that Jim Wallace comes from the same background. Some of you would know Jim from Sojourners, and now at Georgetown University, and the great climate expert and activist Catherine Hayhoe also comes from that background. And so did Garrison Keillor, those of you who might know him from Prairie Home Companion. I kind of thought I was on my way out of religion from a young age. I didn't think that I was going to survive too long as a fundamentalist, but I ended up having a very life-changing spiritual experience at about the age of 14 that really kept me on the path. And of course, I started where I was in that context. But over the years, my questions and my reading and my friendships and my own experiences kept me kind of enlarging my understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. And that's continued to grow until today. I never guessed I would have become a pastor. I really wanted to be, I loved literature, music, art, philosophy, and being an English teacher seemed to be a great place for that to happen. But eventually I left teaching and became a pastor where I served just up the road from you all, just north of you all for about 20 some years. And during that time I started writing books, and I left the pastorate in 2006. And since then have been a writer and public speaker. And I've had the freedom to be involved with a lot of causes that I care about. So I hope that gives kind of a big picture there.
Yeah, good. That gives us a broad feel. As you know, I mentioned when we first talked, I was a very zealous religious teenager also in my
Yes.
Southern Baptist church. And
Yes.
I remember how frightening it was when in my 20s I began to question and turn away. And I know you've written about the loss, the loneliness, the crisis that one can experience during this type of transition. And I can certainly relate to that. Just say a bit more about why losing one's faith brings up those things and is such a traumatic experience, or
Well,
changing even in one's faith if one is
yes.
not.
Yeah. In some ways, changing and staying in your religious community can be really, really difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote about this in some depth in a book called Faith After Doubt. And as I wrote that book, I looked back and tried to say, why did I go through such deep stress and angst in my process really of just growing, just growing intellectually, just learning more, reading more, meeting more amazing people and mentors. And I think a couple of things might point to an answer to your question. One is that faith, even though we might think of it primarily as kind of vertical, directed toward God, is also horizontal. It's almost always practiced within a faith community. And in the last 500 years, in both Catholicism and Protestantism, faith community in some ways has come to mean belief community. In other words, Protestants entered into a conflict with Catholics and protested that they had some bad beliefs and bad practices based on those beliefs. And Protestants then said, we have better beliefs. We have correct beliefs. You have incorrect beliefs. And then we Protestants started dividing from each other. And so in almost all of our denominations, I sometimes call it the church of the last detail. You might have 93% of your beliefs right, but we got the last 7% right. And then when you have that kind of sociology going on, where your boundary markers and your qualifications for membership are holding to this very strict set of beliefs. When you change your beliefs, you could lose your belonging. You start by being suspect, and then eventually, if you step too far out of line, you just don't belong anymore. You might be excommunicated. I have a friend, a young fellow I've been mentoring for the last several years, and he was a zealous young fundamentalist Christian, and he actually became a pastor at a very young age. And then when he changed one of his beliefs, he was defrocked from being a pastor and excommunicated from his church. And it was some of his relatives who were on the elder board that excommunicated him. So, deep pain, and this happens so often. There's maybe one other thing I should add, Theo, and that is that it's not just the social dimension, though. If we take our faith seriously, we kind of align and organize our interior life around our beliefs of what would please God and displease God, what God would approve of and not approve of. And when we become unsure of this, it can be very unsettling for us, and it can create a whole lot of fear and angst and anxiety inside of ourselves, and many other dimensions to it as well. But those are a couple of the main ones.
Yeah. You mentioned your book, Faith After Doubt, and in that, as you write about this, you mentioned 4 stages of faith.
Yes.
Talk about simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony. Were those kind of the stages you felt yourself going through? And just say a little bit about those and how they fit together in a faith journey.
Sure. So I originally was exposed to the idea of stages of human development when I was a college English teacher. And I went through a professional development program at the University of Maryland and was exposed to a stage theory. And that made me curious about other stage theories through the years. But I remember when I walked out of that training, I thought, I didn't just learn how to be a better teacher and understand my students. I think I've just learned something very important about my own spiritual struggles, my own spiritual growth. Um, Probably the simplest stage theory that's out there these days is from my friend Richard Rohr, who talks about 2 stages, the first half of life and the second half of life. The first half of life, where we try to build what he calls a container or a structure of certainty and clarity and so on. And then the second half of life, instead of trying to build the container, we become more interested in what we fill it with. But later, Richard expanded that to 3 stages. He called that first half of life order. And then he said more and more of us are going through an experience of disorder, where we question and challenge what we inherited. And then we come to a kind of reorder. So those 3 stages match pretty well with my 4. My first 2 stages, simplicity and complexity, would be kind of early and late order. And then what he calls disorder is what I would call perplexity. Mm-hmm. And then what he calls the second half of life and reorder is a stage I call harmony or solidarity. We could go into more detail about it, but that's kind of the big picture. It's an arc where you, in a sense, go up, simplicity, complexity, and then you experience a kind of collapse, and you go down in perplexity, and then you begin to build again. And in my experience, that solidarity or harmony becomes a new simplicity. And then I think we can go through that kind of rise and fall, kind of like an incoming tide and an outgoing tide, many times in our lives.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the idea of a new kind of Christianity. We use that as the title for tonight. You've wrote a book by that title. You've used the phrase. Give us a short summary of what you mean by that, and in particular, what's new about it, and how is it different from what most people experience with Christianity?
Yes. So there are a whole lot of ways to talk about this and sort it out. Let me tell you how I stumbled into this way of thinking. When I was in graduate school, what we now call postmodern philosophy was entering the American Academy largely through English departments. It came through the field of literary criticism. And we were reading the post-structuralists and people like Jacques Derrida and Francois Lyotard and Baudrillard and many others. And what they were doing in many ways, and what came to be known as postmodernism, was a you could call a big case of second thoughts after World War II. When you think of what happened, especially in Europe, people felt, gosh, we were the most advanced, civilized, educated, intellectual, enlightened um, uh, countries in the world. And in the 20th century, we went through two world wars and showed ourselves to be capable of violence that we never would have imagined. And so this question, how did Europe that thought it was so enlightened become so violent and destructive and hateful? And it was as if this sort of big ego got burst and people had to acknowledge something's wrong in the way we think. And that work of self-critique, where European intellectuals started saying something is wrong with us, came to be known as postmodernism. Now, that term means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But if you just think of it as a post-World War II reckoning with failure, by the way, that expanded after the Holocaust and the dropping of nuclear bombs that many of us were reminded of recently with the movie Oppenheimer. It expanded in the years after World War II. The last of British colonies of the British Empire and other European colonial holdings were released, often with a lot of violence. But then people look back and they said, for the last 500 years, Europeans have been colonizing the world. What gave them the right to do that? And people started thinking, what happened to the indigenous people? Why did Europeans think they have the right for that? In our country, people started saying, yeah, and what about slavery? And what about the way Native Americans were treated here? And this sort of rethinking among powerful white people. By the way, feminism was a part of this because people started saying, and look how men have been in control and what they've done to women. And along with that was the ecological crisis. And people started saying, we think we're so advanced. Look at what we're doing to the earth. And of course, now that's even more glaring and obvious and of great concern to more and more of us. That rethinking, as I studied it and learned about it, I thought, and Christianity has been part of this. And I remember the day when a thought sort of pinged into my mind. I was having a lot of doubts and questions. And I thought, maybe my problem isn't with Jesus and my problem isn't with the essence of the Christian faith. Maybe my problems are with the modern version of the Christian faith that was linked with colonialism and linked with exploitation of the earth and linked with white male dominance. And that was a liberating thought for me. Maybe I could salvage something in my faith. My problem is with a certain version of my faith. And that's what attracted me to thinking about maybe there's a new kind of Christianity that's not limited by what we've experienced the last 500 years.
Yep. Yep. And you talk about in some ways how this biblical narrative we have
Yes.
has been captured by what you call Greco-Roman way
Yes.
of thinking. And I really liked your description of the six-line narrative
Yes.
of Christianity. And I sense that you're talking about something new other than that is part of
Yes.
what you're talking about. Say a little bit about that, what that
Sure.
is, and what you would contrast to that,
Well, this is such an important question. Because I was an English major, I guess and an English teacher, I had a sensitivity to plots. What's the plot of a novel? What's the plot line of a novel? And I remember I was having breakfast with a couple of other pastors one morning, and I took out a napkin and took out a little felt tip marker. And I remember drawing this line. It went like this. It went across, down, across, sort of a bumpy line down here, up, across. And then at the bottom corner, there was a little trap door that went downward. That was the 6 lines. And I said, I think this is the plot of the Bible that I was taught, that there was a perfect creation in the Garden of Eden. Perfect, by the way, meant unchanging, because if something's perfect, it can't get any better. So any change is for the worse. So it was a perfect creation, and then this fall into a fallen world. And then Jesus represented the possibility for salvation so we could go to heaven, another perfect state. And if things didn't turn out so well, the trapdoor went to hell. And I remember thinking a couple of things when I drew that picture. I thought I was a preacher by this time, and I'd been preaching the Bible for a long time, and often, many times a week. And I thought, if I were just reading the Bible, I would never get this idea of this 6-line narrative. Especially, I had recently preached through the book of Genesis. And I remember as I read Genesis, this does not say what I was taught that it said. And the other thing that I realized was a lot of my theological training, formal and informal, was about how to fit every verse of the Bible into that narrative, whether it wanted to be there or not, And then I remember one of the real groundbreaking moments for me was when it became obvious to me. I had noticed it, and then I did some research and found out I was right, that through the Hebrew scriptures, there is no firm belief in an afterlife, certainly not a heaven or a hell. And a lot of people are confused about that because of the King James Bible. They translated a Hebrew word Sheol with hell, but modern translations don't do that. And I just remember my mind was blown, because if it isn't about heaven and hell, what is it about? And that forced me to say, maybe the story going on in the Bible is different than the one that I was taught. And I think that's part of the foment and the liberation and the excitement about what's happening for more and more of us. We're finding out there's a better storyline, a better plot line than we were taught.
As you talk about finding a new kind of Christianity, you say at one point, we need not a new set of beliefs, but a new way of believing.
Yes.
What's the difference between a way of believing and a set of beliefs?
Yes. So there are so many ways I could express this, but let me express it with a quote from the Dalai Lama. Some years ago, he was asked, if science proved that some Buddhist doctrine was wrong, would you stay with the Buddhist doctrine, or would you rethink it in light of science? And with no hesitation, he just said, well, if someone showed me that one of our doctrines was wrong, I would change the doctrine, because I'm concerned about the truth. I want the truth, And I think what has happened in a lot of religions, but especially in our Christian faith, is that when we started building these very elaborate doctrinal systems, longer and longer lists of beliefs that you have to hold to in order to be an insider in this or that denomination, when we started building these complex belief systems, and we claimed that they were inerrant because they were based on an inerrant Bible, and we trusted the authority figures who made those interpretations and so on, we ended up painting ourselves into a corner. And now it was more important to defend our beliefs than to seek the truth. And I think a kind of faith that we need is less focused on beliefs and more focused on other things. And you might say, well, what could the Christian faith be centered on if it's not beliefs? Well, maybe, let me say it with another quick anecdote. Many of you will know that I have the honor and joy of working closely with Father Richard Rohr. And a month or so ago, it was Richard's 81st birthday. And a bunch of us got on a Zoom call and sang happy birthday to him and watched him blow out a candle. And then in the discussion after that, someone said, Richard, what's your love language? And some of you know, there was a famous book written with several different kinds, I think 5 different kinds of love language, uh, physical affection, the giving of gifts, uh, a number of other ones. And Richard said, I don't really like any of those. He said, I don't need more gifts, and none of them are really my. He said, the thing that is my love language is if you care about what I care about. If you want to be about what I'm about, that's what makes me feel a lot of love and closeness with someone. And what if instead of having beliefs about Jesus, Jesus is really interested in us caring about what he cared about? See, and at that point, the issue of desire and direction and way of life becomes more important than a set of beliefs. It's very interesting. You can be considered an Orthodox Christian by having a whole set of beliefs about Jesus without actually caring about what he cared about. And in fact, without even knowing what he cared about because you haven't been taught. So I think that would be a key shift there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the distinction between a set of beliefs and a way of life
Yes.
that you talk about, right?
Yes.
And
That's
in
right.
some ways, faith ought to be about both of those things, shouldn't it?
Yes,
And how
but
yeah, go ahead.
in fact, in one sense, what we'd have to say is unless we think that at age 8 or 12 or 24 or 31, we reached perfection in our beliefs and our way of life, I think we ought to expect that through our lives, we would continually be refining both our beliefs and what we desire and what we live for and what matters to us. Um, uh, this is even hidden in the word that Jesus used for his followers. His main word for his followers was disciples, which means students or learners. So if we're lifelong learners, it's not that our beliefs are unimportant, it's that as we learn, we continue to deepen and enrich and adapt and adjust our beliefs and how we organize those beliefs and what priorities we give to those beliefs. And I would hope as we grow wiser and deeper and more loving, that we would also be continually adapting and growing in our way of life.
Another quote from Faith After Doubt that I liked was you said we need faith communities big on action, big on love, but small on beliefs and bureaucracy. Just I find that a catchy way of summarizing, it seems, some of what you're saying. What would you add to that or explain about that?
Yes. Um, uh, I just think for many people, I can't tell you through the years, Theo, as I've written about this and talked about it, how many times people have said to me, well, maybe some beliefs are unessential, but what are the essential beliefs? And I could tell you what beliefs I consider essential, but when they ask me, well, what are your essentials or your non-negotiables? I want to say to them, I don't want to answer that question, not because I don't have any, but because I actually don't think that was the point. Um, uh, you can just go through the Gospels and see what Jesus said. He didn't say, by your correct beliefs, they will know you, but rather by the fruit of your life. Or he said, by this will all people know you are my disciples, by having the correct beliefs. No, he said, by this, all people know you're my disciples by the way you love one another. So if we think that Jesus was right, I guess that's a belief. If we think that he was right, if we think he was smart, if we think he was wise, if we think he was on the right track, it seems to me that would make us want to care about what he cared about. And if developing that kind of heart, that kind of caring about what he cared about, that flows out of trust or confidence in him, I think that would get us to a better place than where we certainly are right now.
Yeah, yeah, and then again, you use the phrase talk about faith, but you talk about, and you say it a lot in the Faith After Doubt, the idea of faith expressing itself in love.
Yes.
That seems to be sort of an anchor or a central thought for you
Yes.
as
Well,
you talk about. Yeah.
yeah, one of the things that happens to you when you're a preacher, and I think it happens to everybody who's a active Christian, you get really, really familiar with certain verses in the Bible, and then there are other ones that you just sort of skip over. And somehow I made it very long in my life before I ever really noticed what has become to me one of the most like mind-blowing, disruptive verses in the whole Bible, and it's in the book of Galatians, which, by the way, for people who are interested in biblical scholarship, uh, everybody, virtually everybody. I don't think everybody agrees on anything, but virtually all scholars would say Galatians is the real deal for getting Pauline theology, and Paul says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. And of course, this is one of the main boundary markers for who's considered an insider and an outsider in his religion. So he's saying the primary boundary marker of my religion doesn't mean anything. That's what he says. It doesn't count for anything. And then he says, the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself in love. And of course, that resonates so much with 1 Corinthians 13, without love, I'm nothing. And you just start to see what was Jesus' core concern, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, love your neighbors yourself, is Paul's prime directive as well. So that faith and faith, I noticed someone in the comments made this point. Faith is not the same as beliefs. Faith is trust or confidence. So before, when I said, if you think Jesus is right, that's my way of saying, if you think he's trustworthy, if you actually trust him, then you'll follow his way of life. And that means making love your highest priority. And so many of us are concerned about the state of our churches. Um, Mainline Protestantism reached its peak in about 1960. Evangelicals who came from my background always looked down on mainline Protestants until in the early 2000s, taking away immigration, their numbers reached their peak. And Roman Catholics take away immigration. There's real, what many people call a demographic cliff facing many of our denominations because we're losing our young people. Maybe we could say that some of the people leaving our churches are leaving because they kind of expect better from us, and the emphasis. And if we could promise them, be part of our community, and join us in this path of life, and you will become a more loving person, and your children will become more loving people. It might be a very different future for us.
Yeah, yeah. And you commenting on this idea that faith communities have been defined by belief, you raise the idea that there might be a standard other than belief as a membership requirement.
Yeah.
Would that be something about the way of love,
Yeah.
or how would you say what that might be if it isn't believe these things about the triune God or whatever? But
Yes. Well, let me tell you something. Over these last 15 years or so that I've been traveling so much and speaking in denominations and churches, not only around the country, but around the world, I can't tell you how common this is. I'll be at a church, and the pastor will introduce me to someone, and he'll say, Mary here is one of our most committed members of our community. She's actually Buddhist, but she started coming to our church and felt a lot of love here, and she's become a vital member of our congregation. And you could substitute Buddhist with Jewish or atheist or agnostic or Hindu or Muslim. What's happening already is churches very often have people who come there who say, look, the beliefs don't make sense to me, but
yeah,
I feel love in this community, and I want to be what you're about. Like when at the beginning of the evening, when Beth was talking about New York Avenue Presbyterian, for people to come into a community and say, these people care about our neighbors who are homeless, and these people care about people struggling with mental health issues, and these people care about high school students and providing tutoring, and these people care about folks in Kenya and Cuba, they would say, that's the kind of person I want to be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Good. Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. Let's talk just a little bit about your most recent book, Do I Stay Christian? There are a
Yes.
couple of things in there I'd like to. It's for those who haven't read it, it's very neatly divided into three parts. First part gives lots of arguments why people would say, no, I don't want to stay Christian. And the second part is, yes, here's some reasons too. And the third part, you talk about what you recommend people do, whether they say yes or no, basically. Um, you offer, of course, some pretty strong critiques of Christianity. We're familiar with many of the issues. But maybe summarize just some of the things you said. You referred earlier to that sort of a crisis in the church. Sort of what are some of the main points you make and would make about why people are turned off by Christianity as they
Yes.
understand it?
Yes. Well, the, I'll just mention a few of the first chapters in the book. As you said, the first third of the book is just called No, and it's 10 chapters that summarize the some of the main reasons I've come across in my own life and in other people's lives where people feel a wedge being driven between them and the Christian faith. They feel, I can't in good conscience support an organization that seems to have these characteristics. And the first is anti-Semitism. This goes way, way back to even the early decades of the Christian faith. Jesus was a Jew. All of his original disciples were Jews. But within a few decades, and certainly within a couple generations, there had been this anti-Semitic turn, and it expressed itself in horrible ways. Interestingly, since the Holocaust, many Christians have tried to sort of reverse or make up for their anti-Semitism, and now I think many people are torn in a new way about what's going on in Israel and Gaza, and it just brings to mind that Christians often get very angry for the ways that the state of Israel, and we have to remember that's not all the Jewish people, that's the state of Israel, is treating Palestinians in unconscionable, indefensible ways. And if Christians want to get upset with that, we should, but we should also realize, I hate to say it, but they learned it from us. They're doing to others what Christians did to them in some ugly ways. So, but that history, when people learn about it, they think, why was I never told this? How come the church hasn't done a great job of facing this? Because then anti-Semitism seems to easily bleed into Islamophobia. And so that is one whole area. A second area I mentioned in the early chapters of the book is the history of colonialism and how when Christians are in power, they have tended to treat people of other religions who are minorities in their midst. That connects to colonialism that we mentioned a little while ago. I'll mention one other one. It's what I call constricted intellectualism. It relates to what we were saying about beliefs a little while ago. In many sectors of Christianity, it's not that people are not intellectually active. It's that all of their intellectual energy is spent on defending ourselves and our beliefs rather than spent on seeking the truth and seeking justice and seeking love and the common good. So this constricted intellectualism becomes a real ugly thing for a lot of people.
Yeah. One of the chapters that particularly catches one's eye in Do I Stay Christian is called, you say that Christianity is a sinking, shrinking ship of wrinkling people. I love the wordsmithing there, Brian. And you're pointing about, of course, the demographic problem of increasingly an older church that's therefore out of touch. And I hadn't really thought as much about it, but how this in some ways is driving the church to be more regressive and extreme because of this demographic problem. How significant a factor is that?
Well, we're talking a lot about climate change these days. And as you know, this is a big concern of mine. But we could also say not only is the climate changing at an unprecedented rate, but culture has been changing at an unprecedented rate. It's just accelerating. When I think of the difference in my grandfather's life from when he was born to when he died, and then I think of the difference in my life from when I was born to when I die, this is a change curve that, previous generations didn't have to deal with. Everyone's had to deal with change, and sometimes very abrupt changes, like a pandemic or a invasion or a war. But this sense that the world is changing so quickly puts younger generations in a real bind if their religious community isn't allowed to change. Maybe on a very superficial level, they're not allowed to change the style of music they like. They're not allowed to change the way they dress. They're not allowed to change using old English and certain terminology. They're not allowed to change the relative roles of men and women, or they're not allowed to rethink how LGBTQ people should be understood and treated. And so this inability of many of our religious institutions to change puts young people in this awkward, untenable position. I have just a couple of options. I can be increasingly out of sync with my generation, which you might say, well, that's tough. You'll need to do that. But interestingly, the older generation didn't have to do that in the same way. So it puts this unfair burden. It reminds me of what Jesus said about the religious leaders who put huge loads on people's backs that they wouldn't even lift a finger to bear themselves. Or it makes people have to leave, or it makes people have to pretend when they're in church and live with a different mindset and vocabulary and understanding in church, and then live in a different way, which creates its own, what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. So that's a serious problem that we're putting younger generations through. And so they start dropping out. And that can create a vicious cycle that I still don't think our congregations have faced the emergency that actually represents.
You've commented a lot about and talked about religious language in different ways, and kind of how we talk about the ineffable experiences of a person's spiritual life.
Yes.
I want to read a question I received from one of our church members about religious language and sort of get your response.
Yes.
It's a little long, but I think it encapsulates what a number of people feel. And this person said in his question, many of us cherish the liturgy, ceremony, hymns, and symbols of our traditional Christian faith and worship, even though we may not literally believe the words we speak in worship, or even think they're the best or most useful description of our understanding of God. I enjoy singing the doxology and even tear up when we say the Apostles' Creed during a baptism, but triune God isn't something I wrap my head around, and the whole descended into hell thing is at best metaphorical for me. If someone exploring the relevance of Christianity came to our worship and asked, what's up with that? My first impulse would be to say, oh no, we don't really believe all that, which comes across as at best inauthentic and at worst hypocritical. Well, what's a better way to think about and talk about this disconnect that I sometimes feel?
Oh my, I love that member of your congregation is very articulate and very honest. And can I just say, there are so many people who feel that way, and even so many clergy who feel that way, and they don't have the courage or the freedom to admit it. I think his use of the word tearing up, it brings that word nostalgia to mind. And so many things in life are about nostalgia. And as I get older, I value nostalgia. There are I think all of us get this strange affinity with the popular songs that were on the radio when we were in high school or college. And I hear those songs still. And I remember that dance, and I remember that girlfriend, and I remember that, party, and I remember that band and the concert I went to. And so that's part of how our brain works. unfortunately, we have equated nostalgia with spirituality. If you have intense nostalgia about church, we think of you and often think of ourselves as these deeply spiritual people. Well, we might be, we might not be. We may just be nostalgic. Um, and and when so much is at stake, as it is, well, it always has been at stake. Nostalgia, nostalgia is really nice, but it's no way to run a religion. It's not the purpose of religion. Well, I should say it is the purpose of religion for a lot of people. But there are a whole lot of us. This is one of our deepest dissatisfactions. Nostalgia is great, but it's not what this thing is supposed to be about. Uh, I'll tell you, can I just give an interesting little biblical reflection on that, Theo?
Sure.
One of the really troubling passages in the Gospels always used to bother me is where Jesus says, "Don't think I've come to bring peace, but a sword." Uh, and 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 of course, that's disturbing language. And I don't think it was till maybe 10 or 15 years ago that I noticed what he follows it up with. I have come to set a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, a son against his father. And in each case, he says, I've come to set the younger generation against the older generation. And if Jesus was dealing with something like nostalgia in his time, I think he was saying, I'm taking sides here and I'm taking sides with the younger generation. And this is going to be disruptive. But we can't be about what we've always been about. And we need to grow into the next stage. So, that's to me why his message is often called the good news. It's something new. And let's keep nostalgia in as many places as we can, but let's not let it get in the way of our real purpose.
So keeping the language in some ways, but not let it get in the way or put too much on it, hold it in a somewhat different way.
Well, I'll be honest. I personally, if I could wave a magic wand and make something happen, I would, I would, I wish that Pope Francis and the leader of the Anglican Communion and the leader of the the leaders of the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopal Church and the Methodist Church, I wish that they would declare an emergency and say, our liturgies, people have lots of nostalgia, but they are not saying what people need to say.
Mm-hmm.
They're not, my definition of liturgy, we often call liturgy the work of the people. I think a better term for it would be the work out of the people. Liturgy is like going to a spiritual gym. And it's exercising our soul to do things that we need to be good people and we need sometimes just to survive. And the fact that our liturgies are not compelling people and the fact that their primary value for many people is nostalgia, to me is a sign that this could be the beginning of a liturgical renaissance that we desperately need. Let me say it this way. When we recite a creed, and I have nothing against creeds, but when we recite a creed, we might think we're being faithful to our ancestors, but there's a way we could be unfaithful to our ancestors for this reason. If our ancestors, the leaders of our fellow Christians in the 4th century or the 5th century or the 16th century got together and said, we have to articulate what is absolutely essential for these times. If we keep repeating what they say, we violate their example, because maybe if we followed their example, we'd have to get together and say, we've got to keep repeating what's absolutely essential for these times. And so that to me is, I imagine some people will not like that. And not many people listen to me on this, so they shouldn't be afraid.
I think our congregation, like a lot of congregations, has some mixture of the traditional language, and then we try to develop liturgy that is
Yes.
much more modern, and that both happen sort of side
Yes.
by side, I think. And that seems to be the path a lot of people have taken.
Could I add one thing to that?
Yeah,
Theo?
sure.
I just think what we ought to do, and I think that's a beautiful compromise, a beautiful way to work that out. I think that's just God bless you for doing everything you can to help people feel the familiar is still there, but not limiting yourself to that. God bless you. But it would be nice if we put like a warning label. Like, for example, every time we have a scripture reading, I think we ought to say, some of us take the Bible literally here. Some of us do not take the Bible literally here. And what we agree on is that we should look for the meaning, not just the
Good.
information.
I like that a lot. Yeah.
Because here's what happens. If one of my friends who's not a church going person comes to church with me some Sunday and they hear some passage from the Bible about God smiting these people or telling the people to smite those people, they think, what kind of a crazy cult have I gotten myself into? I remember when I was a pastor in the DC area, a mother contacted me and she said, Brian, I'm not from a religious background. I've been coming to your church for a few months. This is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm a single mom. I bring my son, but my son came home from Sunday school like he's been having nightmares ever since last Sunday. I said, oh my gosh, what happened? She said they talked to him about blood, about smearing blood on the door. And she said, we don't let him watch horror movies and things like that. And he's just like, this is disturbed him so much. And I remember in that moment, I thought, I grew up all my life hearing about blood, in Christian, but you just realize how weird and wacky that sounds to people.
Yeah.
And if we're going to use that language, we better do a lot of explaining, I think.
Yeah, good. I want to invite Meg to come on here in a second and share some of the questions she's seen coming in from people. But before I do want to ask just you to comment briefly on one other thing. Where do you see hope in terms of the future of Christianity in America in particular? I loved your quote from Phyllis Tickle, where she talks in her book, The Great Emergence. She said, every 500 years or so, the Christian faith holds a rummage sale and sorts through all that is accumulated over recent centuries. What feels like extra baggage, it sends to the recycling, and what feels like essential gear, it preserves for the future, opening a new chapter in Christian history. Do you think that's happening? Are we at a point where that kind of reckoning is happening? And what hopeful signs do you see around that?
Yeah, I think it's happening. It's happening too slow. And so conversations like this, I hope will fill people with a sense of urgency to hasten that process. Because there's such a thing as being too late. And so, but I do think it's happening. I think it's been happening for over a generation in our seminaries, but it hasn't made its way down to the pews in so many of our congregations. And I imagine it has a lot in a church like New York Avenue Presbyterian, but we all know there are, probably a majority of churches where even if the pastor learns some of these things in seminary, when he or she gets a job in a congregation, the congregation doesn't want to hear it, and they'll get fired if they talk about it.
Yeah.
But in terms of hope, Theo, here's how I would say it. There's a period of time where you're having a downswing and there's hope of renewal. But then there's a time where you go past the hope of renewal and you look for the hope of rebirth. And I think in some settings, renewal might still be possible, but I think in a lot of settings, our hope is hope of rebirth. And I have great hope in rebirth.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We want to expand our conversation. Lots more to be talked about. I'm glad we have you for a couple of other sessions coming up. I didn't get to all my questions, but we want to see what some others have got. And I want to invite Meg to come in and share with us some questions that have come in.
Thanks, Meg. Hi.
Yeah, hi, Brian. Thanks so much. What a great conversation. I've been trying to combine some questions here. So I think I will start going back a little bit in the conversation to the stages of faith. There are some questions. Martha asked, Are they related to Lawrence Kohlberg's stages? And are they, his are very fixed? Are they more expansive? Connected to that, you spoke a little bit about this at the end, but how do we relate to people who are at different stages of faith without
Yes.
either thinking you're behind us
Yes.
or you've left us?
Yes. Well, first of all, a very knowledgeable person to ask that question. For folks, all of our non-clergy and non-theological nerds here, um, there were a number of very influential writers in the 20th century about stages of faith. Lawrence Kohlberg was one, and James Fowler was another. And in the secular world, from William Blake, the poet of the early 1800s, to Søren Kierkegaard about the same time, into the 20th century with Piaget and Freud in the world of psychology and child development, and then theorists like Ken Wilber and others. There have been so many people working in this area of human development, and they have so many different stage theories. In my book, Faith After Doubt, I put a chart at the end, and I kind of line up the different stages that all of the major theorists that I have read, and they really do sort of, they, like, for example, I talk about 4 stages. There's nothing magic about 4. If you were to say there's an early and late stage within each of those 4, now you have 8 stages, right? And if you were to say there's an early, middle, and late stage of each, now you have 12 stages. So it's amazing how well they line up. And I should add, an important thing happened in the late 20th century, because almost all the theorists, as in many other areas, were male, and often their research subjects were all male. And so there's been a number of theorists coming from a feminist viewpoint who've actually studied stages, especially in women, and unique insights come there that I think apply to men as well. I think it's broadened and deepened the conversation. And then in the last few decades, there's been fascinating research on racial identity development. And I've read quite a bit in this field, and it seems to me to overlay in powerful ways with faith development too. So if we just realize that when faith is working well, it actually brings us through the stages of development. When faith is working in a more cultic way, a more controlling way, what it does is it traps us in one stage and actually impedes our development. So another reason I think that's so important. It's so important to think about how faith helps us develop as human beings.
So one way to relate to people at different stages is to think in that bigger picture, or thinking about the way we tell like stories to our children, where we are kind of communicating the story which the children take as literal. And then how do we not feel, this goes back to that other question, kind of that cognitive dissonance? Well, it's not really true, but we're talking about this anyway. And sometimes I've talked to people and I think, oh, we're saying the same words, but we're talking about very different things.
Yes. Yeah.
So how do you cross those bridges?
Yeah. My friend, Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, a pastor at Middle Church in New York City, she says, we need a grown-up God, and we need a grown-up faith, and we need a grown-up way of reading the Bible. And I would add, and then we need to find a way to teach that to children. And I think it's very, very doable. I noticed in the chat, someone mentioned the story of Noah, which, Sunday schools love to do Noah because they get to draw pictures of animals and have them going in a boat, and everybody likes boat rides and everybody likes animals. Of course, then we realize that what the story actually says is pretty horrific. Every living creature and every human being in the world, children, grandmas, grandpas, are killed. It's a very brutal story if you take it literally. But so many fascinating ways that we can teach this to children. There is something many of you might be familiar with. You might use it in your church, I don't know, called godly play. And one of the things that godly play does is it helps children tell a story and then lets children question the story and interact with the story. And they aren't punished or scolded for saying, I don't like that, or that doesn't seem fair. In a sense, what we're doing is we're allowing children to be vital members of the interpretive community. But I also think most of our children have a lot of savvy in interpreting stories as long as they're told they don't have to take it literally. And just a quick example, in one of my books, I tell the story of a woman who came up to me and said that her daughter came and asked her if the story of Elijah, some of you probably have never heard this story, but it's a story in the Bible called about a prophet named Elijah in the Hebrew scriptures who ascends to heaven in a fiery chariot. And her daughter came to her and said, is that real or is it make believe? And when she asked me, what should she have said? I said, well, what did you say? She said, I told her some stories are real, some stories are make believe, some are a mix of the two. What do you think? And I thought that was the most wonderful way for her mother to answer. She gave her daughter options, and then she gave her daughter a voice by saying, what do you think? And she was going to listen to her daughter's thoughts about this. That to me is when we were talking about a way of having faith rather than just arguing about what our beliefs. That's a way of having faith that's inviting people to be members of a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years.
Thank you. Shifting gears just a little bit, there have been a lot of questions that in some ways are about vocabulary. Betsy wonders, can we reclaim the word Christian? Because for many, it connects to evangelicals in this political climate.
Yes.
Don wonders whether the word God has reached the end of its usefulness.
Yes.
So what do we do with our, not just with our liturgies and creeds, but with our vocabulary? How do we tell people who we are?
Yes. Can I just say those two questions, I'm so grateful to folks for asking those questions. That's, if I can just take a bit of a tangent, Meg, that's why when I wrote, Do I Stay Christian? I had those three sections. Part one, 10 reasons, good reasons to say no, I do not want to stay Christian. And then the second part was called Yes. And in that section, I said, are there ways that you could have eyes wide open to the first 10 chapters, not minimize them, not try to hide them or erase them, eyes wide open to those problems? Are there ways and reasons you could say, yes, I will stay Christian? And then when I got to the end of that section, I realized some people will stay Christian. Some people will not. Some who stay Christian might stay for really terrible reasons. Some who leave might leave for terrible reasons. Some who do the opposite could do it for really good reasons. But what I think, after working through 2/3 of that book, I thought the deeper question is, what kind of human being do I want to be? And I actually think that's the question that Jesus was really obsessed with and or focused on, and what I think Paul was really focused on in the New Testament. There's a place where Jesus says, don't tell me you're sons of Abraham. God could turn these stones into sons of Abraham. In other words, your labels aren't the important thing. The important thing is what kind of person are you and are you becoming? So, that question about Christian, is it salvageable? It depends on us. For the rest of history, it will be recorded, if people keep recording history honestly, that in the last some number of years, Christians have done unconscionable things and have abandoned the very values that they proclaimed, and have, if I can use Jesus' words, strained at gnats and swallowed camels. That will be part of the historical record for everybody to see. 100 years from now, people can watch a video of the insurrection on January 6th, and they'll see people holding up Bibles and praying in Jesus' name and, all the rest. That's history. What's not history is whether others of us will say, this is our moment to dig deeper into the real heart of Jesus' message and to find the best elements of our Christian tradition. And we became brighter lights than we'd ever been. So that's the part of history that's really up to us. Some people will not stay, others will, but let's shine our lights very brightly. One other quick thing, the question about the word God, I struggle with this too. And I really appreciate the person who raised this question. Because the word God it just seems like every day is used for worse and worse atrocities, not just by Christians. I watch how Benjamin Netanyahu and others in the Israeli government, and I watch how Muslim extremists are racing with Christians for our abuse of the word God. So it really is problematic. But then when I mentioned the best of the Christian tradition, now we rediscover people like Meister Eckhart, who, in the 1200s was teaching people to pray, God, rid me of God. It was his way of saying that the God who really exists we have to pray to be rid of the notions of God that are harmful and unhelpful. And took a lot of courage for him to say that then. I think it does for us today, but it's a great opportunity too.
We're back to renewal versus rebirth as well, aren't we? The kind of where are we?
In fact, people might be interested to know this, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as he watched Germany and the German churches descend into a personality cult lining up behind Adolf Hitler, Bonhoeffer said, we may have to go through a generation where we don't speak anything, where we just shut up, because we have to let the dust settle for how the words of our faith have been so horribly, blasphemously, harmfully abused. And he was expressing what I think many of us feel. We don't know what to say. And by the way, for people who don't know what to say, I think somebody asks, are you a Christian? I think an honest answer is, I don't know what to say. And then tell them what you're for and what you're against. I really think Jesus was amazing. And I've built my life around following him. And I've benefited so much from my life in the church. But what seems to pass for Christianity today turns my stomach, and I don't want to be associated with that. So the question gives us an opportunity to give a really honest answer.
Right. Thinking about your notions about faith expressing itself in love and communities of action.
Yes.
There have been some questions. Where does personal spirituality fit and practice, personal spiritual practices? Where do they fit in this new kind of Christianity?
Yes. Yeah, I think they go from being sort of level B or level C or level D of importance, and they really go up to the top tier of importance. Not that there's some number of practices that we have to do to maintain our standing. Like, it would be a big mistake if we said, you used to have to believe 10 beliefs. Now you have to do 10 practices, But if it's really about desire, then if we're clear on what we desire, then each of us is in the situation of saying, what practices do I need to help me become the kind of person I desire to be? The deepest part of me that's trying to be formed and shaped, what are the practices that I need? And that is both liberating and transformative, because when we shift the focus, who am I trying to become? If deep inside me, I want to be a person who seeks the truth. I want to be a person guided by love. I want love to be the way I see everyone and everything. Then when we realize how often we're out of sync with that, then we start to say, what are the practices that will help me? And wouldn't it be wonderful if uh, 20 or 50 or 100 years from now, there are churches where people are lining up outside because they say these folks are focusing on what really, really matters. And they're helping people experience that kind of transformation.
Thank you. One more, I guess, kind of moving a little bit towards the May 8th
Yes.
webinar, which will be more about the church, the
Yes.
church for the future. Churches have served in history and still do for some people today as places of their rites of passage
Yes.
and also as places for people to form committed relationships and
Yes.
kind of ethical and moral standards.
Yes.
And one person says that he doesn't hear much from the mainline church about, for example, committed relationships these days.
Yes.
What could the role of this new kind of Christianity or the church for the future be for
Yes.
these kinds of rites of passage?
Oh my goodness. I love that. I just love that. I love that question. I almost don't want to say anything about it, but just to lift the question up and say, let's all of us think about that question. Like if you were to think of your own life and and you were to think, where did I really need help? You know, nowhere in the Bible and nowhere in ancient church history were there marriage preparation classes, right? But one of the best things for me was when I got marriage preparation. And one of the best things I did as a pastor is when we did preparation for committed relationships. And you just realize, I wonder, how does anybody survive if they don't get really, really good training? Well, then you add to that, you know, parents, what the toughest period of life, just in terms of demands, or when you're a parent of young children. And often it gets even as intense again when you're a parent of a teenager or a young adult. Um, uh, what would happen if we just sat back and said, we're going to start over again? And we're going to build resources to help people at those critical junctures of life. We're going to help them make it through those passages. We know what they are. We're going to get the best information and training methods we can. And we're going to make sure our clergy and key lay people and leaders are involved so that we're able to help people with those rites of passage. I mentioned Richard Rohr earlier. One of the things Richard noticed is how much men need rites of passage. Ideally, it would be rites of passage when they're 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, as they're going from childhood into adulthood. And women need them too. And oh my goodness, people my age need them when people are aging and there's one loss after another. I just love that question.
Well, thanks so much. There were lots of questions that came in, and I'm going to hand it back over to Theo.
Thank you, Meg. Thanks, everybody, for those great questions.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to all who sent in questions. Want to take, and thank you in particular, Brian, for your great comments, and Meg for doing such a good job of sorting through that. I want to take just a couple of moments and share some announcements, and then we'll call on Brian again here in just a couple of minutes to make some final comments as we come to a close. There was some discussion briefly at the end there about the Church of the Future. And this is a good segue into talking about our next program, which on May 8th, 4 weeks from tonight, the topic, again with Brian, will be creating a church for the future. And we look forward to that. He'll be making a presentation, and then there'll be discussion with him after that. And then again, save the dates, October, actually, I think it may be 5 and 6. It's that weekend, first weekend of October. There'll be in-person programs at New York Avenue. And as we look forward to having Brian with us again a couple of times, we want you to be aware of his books. some that you may want to see, and it's such a long list, we can't list all of them, but here in chronological order are some of the main books that Brian has written over the last 20 years. Generous Orthodoxy, you see this, A New Kind of Christianity, which we talked about earlier from 2010, and then more books, more recent ones. A wonderful title, Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Muhammad Cross the Road? And you see the other kinds of issues. We Make the Road by Walking, which is more of a devotional book, and just really wonderful, rich resource of books. And I urge you to go online and learn about these and purchase some of them or check them out of a library. And then we want to finally look at the most recent books. We talked some about Faith After Doubt, Do I Stay Christian? And the new book that Brian has written that is now in pre-sale and will be released in about 5 weeks, I believe. And of course, we'll be talking about that more at the next webinar on May 8th. Now, in order to be ready for that webinar, we want to suggest that people who are going to attend that webinar take some time to look at 2 chapters from Brian's book, Faith After Doubt. If you own the book or want to get it, we recommend, of course, you read the whole thing. It's really very rich. But particularly chapters 11 and 12, Communities of Harmony and Theologies of Harmony, are good background reading for what we'll be looking at on May 8th. And we've created a link for you. You see it there, and we'll send this to you in an email, nyapc.org/MSIR book. And you can just click a link, go to that link, and read the chapters online. So again, we'll email that link to you. They're not long chapters, but we really urge you to spend a little time before the next time reading those chapters, particularly if you haven't done so before. One final note on future programs for the McClendon Scholar program is that this summer, every summer we have a summer scholar who is with us on multiple occasions, and we're very happy to announce that the new dean of the Howard University School of Divinity, Dr. Kenyatta Gilbert, will be making several presentations throughout the summer, and we'll send you information on those dates and subjects in the near future. Also, remember, you can learn about all of our past and future programs on the McClendon Scholar website, which is nyapc.org/MSIR. That's being put into chat also now for you. And there are recordings of many different scholars that we've had over the past several years. And of course, all the information about future programs. Now, before I invite Brian to come back and make some final comments, I want to pose a question for you to think about, reflect on, and if you are inclined to take a moment and write some thoughts into chat. What did you hear tonight that was helpful to you that you'd like to remember in the future? I find that when I write my thoughts down, I clarify them, and also it helps me to remember them. And I think that's likely true with a lot of people. So invite you to think about the answer to that and maybe write in chat now over the next few moments what it is that was helpful that you'd really like to remember. We'll keep chat open for a few moments, even after we close, so you can write some thoughts that you may want to record about in response to that question. I now want to invite Brian back as we get near the end of time, just for a few moments to share whatever final words he wants to leave us with. Brian, we really appreciate you. We look forward to more time with you. And as we adjourn, glad to hear whatever final thought you have.
Well, I'm so happy to be with you all. What a good night and what great questions. I just want to tell you all, one of my mentors years ago said to me, Brian, learning is not the consequence of teaching. Learning is the consequence of thinking. And it's clear that you all are thinking people and you're asking questions and you're not just, eager to just get your idea out there. You're curious and you're thinking and asking questions. And And that's why I love this question Theo is closing us with. What really matters now is what you think about and what you talk about over the next day. Sometime in the next 24 hours, somebody might say, "Hey, what's new?" And you could say, "Oh, I was on this webinar last night," and share with them some idea that was of interest to you or some question it raises for you. Let this continue to resonate. Let the ripples spread. Learning is not the consequence of teaching; it's the consequence of thinking. I think that's why Jesus spoke in parables. He knew he needed to give us something that would make us think so that we would begin to change our way of thinking, not just our thoughts, and our way of having faith, not just our beliefs. So what a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you to everybody who has joined us this evening. We want to thank you for your time. We look forward to having you with us for future programs, particularly on May 8th. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us, and good night.